Ma'am, step outside. Now. The voice was sharp, commanding, the kind that doesn't ask twice. I froze mid-step, my wrench still in my hand, oil dripping down my glove, staining the concrete below. Through the thin pane of my garage window, red and blue lights flashed across my driveway, dancing on the hood of my old Chevy. It felt like a raid. Except this wasn't a chop shop or drug house. It was my home. My life. My garage. The sound of boots echoed outside, gravel crunching as officers moved closer. My son, Ryan, peeked through the living room blinds, his voice trembling. "Mom, are we in trouble?" I didn't know what to say. My mind scrambled through possibilities. Unpaid ticket? Some misunderstanding? I wiped my hands on my work rag and opened the door, heart pounding against my ribs like a hammer. 3 officers stood there. Behind them, arms crossed and chin raised like a self-appointed king, was Greg Sanders, our HOA president. His polo shirt was tucked too tight, his sunglasses gleaming, and his little clipboard clutched in one hand like it gave him authority. "Mrs. Mitchell," one of the officers said, "we've received a formal complaint from your HOA. You're allegedly operating a business out of a residential property. We're here to inform you this violates your community bylaws." I blinked, trying to process his words. "Operating a business?" I repeated. "This is my personal garage. I fix my own cars, sometimes my neighbors, for free." Greg stepped forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "Don't play innocent, Laura. We've had multiple reports of engine noise, customer traffic, and oil spills. This is a neighborhood, not a mechanic strip mall." My neighbors had gathered on their lawns, whispering, recording on their phones. I could feel my face burning as one woman across the street shook her head in disapproval. Humiliation sank into my chest like wet cement. One of the officers adjusted his belt awkwardly. "Do you have a business license, ma'am?" I laughed. A sharp, nervous laugh that didn't sound like me. "I don't need a business license to fix my own car. You can check the zoning. This is my property, my space." Greg gave a smug smile. "Not anymore, it isn't." The officer glanced back at him, confused. "Sir, we'll need to verify the documentation before taking further action." Greg lifted his clipboard, tapping it like a magician about to pull a trick. "Already done. The HOA board has documented repeated violations." But when the officer looked over the papers, he frowned. "These aren't county records. These are internal HOA reports. You don't have legal enforcement authority, sir." For a brief second, I saw Greg's jaw tighten, the power he thought he had, slipping, but he covered it quickly. "We're cooperating with law enforcement," he said smoothly, "to ensure community compliance." I looked at the EES officer, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sir, can I see the specific rule I've broken? The one that says I can't fix my own car in my own garage?" He hesitated. "It's not clear from what we have, ma'am. We'll need to contact the HOA's management office." I could hear Greg exhale sharply through his nose. "Fine," he said, turning away. "But this isn't over." As the police cars pulled away, I stood there in the fading sunlight, the smell of gasoline still thick in the air, my hands trembling. My neighbors retreated behind curtains, their curiosity satisfied for the day. I looked down at the wrench still in my hand, the same one I'd used to fix engines, not break laws. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had deliberately turned the system against me, using badges, bylaws, and fear. And that's when I realized someone was using the police to destroy me. I built that garage with my bare hands after my husband's funeral. Now it was being treated like a crime scene. After the police left that morning, I sat on the edge of my workbench, staring at the wrench still slick with oil. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The garage was quiet again, too quiet, and for the first time, I felt like a stranger inside the one place that had kept me sane. It all started 2 years earlier, on a cold February morning. My husband, Tom, never made it home from a highway accident. One drunk driver. That's all it took to turn my world to ashes. I remember the silence afterward, the house echoing without his laughter, the bills stacking up faster than the sympathy cards. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to step outside, until one afternoon, I walked into this old detached garage, the one Tom had always dreamed of turning into a workshop, and I started cleaning. The smell of dust and motor oil hit me like memory itself. His old socket set was still hanging on the pegboard. His name, TM, was scratched into the handle of his favorite wrench. And somehow, picking it up felt like touching him again. That's when it clicked. I couldn't bring him back, but I could keep what he loved alive. I sold my jewelry, picked up part-time work, and spent months repairing the garage. New lights, insulation, flooring. My fingers bled from sanding those rough wooden beams, but every scrape reminded me I was still here, still fighting. When it was done, that garage wasn't just a workspace. It was my heartbeat. It started small. I'd fix my own car, then a neighbor's lawnmower, then a friend's pickup that wouldn't start. No money at first, just favors, trade-offs, kindness. People appreciated the honesty, the craftsmanship. They'd drop by with coffee, stay for conversation. It made the house feel alive again. Even Greg Sanders, our HOA president, had once stood right here, complimenting my work. I still remember him chuckling as I tightened a bolt on his daughter's car. "You could give the guys at Sanders Auto a run for their money," he'd said. I thought it was a joke. But a month later, everything changed. It started with a letter. Notice of noise violation. The HOA claimed my garage created disturbances inconsistent with neighborhood harmony. I stared at it in disbelief. My work hours ended by 6 p.m., and I didn't use heavy equipment. The letter didn't list a single specific date, time, or witness. When I called Greg to ask what this was about, his tone had shifted. "Just keeping things professional, Laura," he said coldly. "You've become a bit too busy over there." That's when I noticed it. Greg's brother owned Sanders Auto Repair, the only full-service garage within 5 miles. I'd seen the ads. Family-owned since 1988. I'd never thought twice about it, but now it all started to make sense. The timing, the sudden hostility, the police inspection that humiliated me. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was competition. From that point on, it didn't matter how quietly I worked. If a wrench dropped, someone complained. If a car door closed, I'd get a letter. Greg's smile turned into a smirk every time he saw me. That garage had saved my life once, but now it was being weaponized against me. The very place that had helped me breathe again, now labeled as illegal. I tightened my jaw, staring at the freshly posted violation notice on my door. The ink bled slightly from the morning rain, the HOA letterhead barely legible, and suddenly every sound from my garage became a weapon against me. By the 3rd week, the mailman stopped making eye contact. Each envelope from the HOA was thicker and nastier than the last. At first, I tried to laugh it off. 1 or 2 letters, fine. Maybe Greg was trying to flex his HOA power. But by the 3rd week, it had become a daily ritual. Every morning, I'd step out to grab the mail, and there it would be. Another white envelope stamped with that same HOA seal, folded too precisely, like it was designed to intimidate me before I even opened it. Inside were accusations that made my blood boil. Unauthorized commercial activity, visual blight, repeated violation of community guidelines. Each notice came with blurry photos, a car tire, a trash can, a shadow that could have been anyone. One even claimed my garage emitted toxic fumes endangering residents. I didn't even use chemicals that harsh. At first, I thought it was just Greg, but it started spreading. Mrs. Henson, the sweet old lady who used to bring me lemonade in the summer, suddenly crossed the street when she saw me. 2 teenage boys whispered "mechanic criminal" as they rode by on their bikes. Even my next-door neighbor, Pete, wouldn't meet my eyes. Greg had poisoned them with paperwork and whispers. I finally decided I wasn't going to take it quietly. I called the HOA office and requested to see the records, the evidence they claimed they had against me. The receptionist hesitated. "Mr. Sanders hasn't approved the release of those files yet," she said, almost apologetically. "Approved?" I repeated. "They're public HOA records. I have every right to see them." And I did. I knew enough by then to check the state statutes. Under our state's HOA transparency law, any homeowner can request to inspect association records and violation reports within 10 business days. It wasn't just my right, it was the law. So I sent a certified letter, quoting the statute directly. That's when the tone shifted. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel outside. I peeked through my blinds. Greg's silver SUV idled near my mailbox. He wasn't alone. Another board member stood beside him, flashlight in hand, taking photos of my garage. I stepped outside and called out, "What are you doing?" Greg didn't flinch. He just smiled. "Community inspection," he said coolly. "Don't worry, Laura. It's all by the book." He got back in his truck and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after he was gone. The next morning, another letter waited for me. This one heavier, thicker. My stomach twisted before I even opened it. Inside, in bold red ink, it screamed across the top line, "Final police action notice." And just like that, I knew. This was no longer about bylaws or noise complaints. Greg was escalating, and he wasn't going to stop until I broke. Then came a letter with red ink across the top. "Final police action notice. Turn that music off right now," an officer shouted over the party speaker. Cupcakes fell from my hands as my son's friends went silent. The backyard that had been filled with laughter seconds ago turned into a crime scene. My heart dropped. It was Ryan's 15th birthday, the one day I'd promised him would be normal. We'd set up balloons, a few tables, and a small speaker by the grill. Nothing wild, nothing loud, just family, cake, and a little joy we'd both needed for months. But the flashing red and blue lights at the curb wiped that all away. 3 officers walked up the driveway, hands on their belts, scanning the property like they expected to find a riot. Behind them, of course, stood Greg Sanders. Clipboard in hand, fake concern painted across his face, pretending he was assisting law enforcement. "What's going on?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Noise complaint," one officer said, raising his voice over the fading music. "We received multiple reports of disturbance coming from this property." I looked around at the group of 15-year-olds frozen mid-bite, at the soft country song still playing low on the speaker. "Disturbance?" I repeated. "It's a birthday party." Greg took a step forward, his tone syrupy but sharp. "Laura, the rules are the rules. You know our community bylaws. Excessive noise after 6 p.m. isn't tolerated. I warned you before." I clenched my fists, trying not to shake. It wasn't even 6 yet. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The officers glanced between us, clearly uncomfortable. One of them looked barely older than my son. "Ma'am," he said softly, "maybe just wrap it up for tonight, okay?" Ryan stood beside me, eyes wide, humiliated in front of his friends. "Mom, did we do something wrong?" He whispered. That question broke something in me. I took out my phone, not to argue, but to record. "For my records," I said quietly, pressing the red circle. Greg's head snapped toward me when he saw the camera. His fake smile vanished. "You can't record this without permission," he barked. "I'm on my property," I replied. "And in this state, one-party consent is perfectly legal." I turned the camera toward the officer, who just nodded, avoiding Greg's glare. Within minutes, the officers gave up. There was no noise violation, no legal reason to be there. They muttered apologies and left. But Greg lingered, standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed like he'd won something. "Happy birthday," he said dryly before walking off. That night, after Ryan had gone to bed, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to. "Mrs. Mitchell," a deep voice said. "This is Officer Daniels. I was at your house earlier." My stomach tightened. "Yes?" He lowered his voice. "You might want to check your county zoning files. Something doesn't add up with the HOA's complaint." I sat there in the dark, the glow of my phone reflecting off the kitchen window, realizing I'd just been handed a thread that could unravel everything. I didn't know it yet, but that call would expose everything. "You'd better see this," the county clerk whispered, sliding a folder across the counter. My name was on a zoning document, but not in my handwriting. The next morning after that late-night call, I drove straight to the county administration building. I didn't even bother with coffee. I just grabbed my purse, printed the latest HOA notice, and left. The entire ride there, I kept hearing Officer Daniels's voice, "Check your zoning files." I had no idea what that meant, but something deep inside me knew I was about to find out why Greg had been so confident. Too confident. The county zoning office smelled of paper, toner, and old coffee, the kind of smell that carries a history of quiet cover-ups and buried truths. A woman named Mrs. Elkins sat behind a cluttered desk, her glasses perched low on her nose. "Can I help you, hon?" she asked, pushing aside a stack of property maps. "Yes," I said, sliding my HOA notice across the counter. "My HOA claims I'm breaking residential use zoning laws. I need to see the zoning file for my address." She typed my name into her computer, the clack of keys echoing in the quiet room. A minute later, her eyebrows shot up. "Well, that's odd," she murmured. "You're listed as mixed-use residential. That means you can operate light business activity from your property. No issue there." "Mixed use?" I repeated, relief flooding through me. "So my garage isn't illegal?" She shook her head. "Not at all. You're well within county limits, but—" She frowned and clicked a few more times. "Wait a minute. There's another record here. One that says your zoning was changed to residential only just last year." My heart sank. "Changed? By who?" Mrs. Elkins hesitated, then got up and disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she was holding a brown folder with my address printed on the tab. She looked around the office, lowered her voice, and leaned closer. "You'd better see this." She opened the folder and laid the papers flat on the counter. The first page was familiar. My original zoning certificate, signed 5 years ago when Tom and I bought the house. But stapled behind it was another document, newer, and typed in a slightly different font. It declared that my property had been reclassified as residential only. No commercial activity permitted. At the bottom, under requesting party, was the signature, Greg Sanders. I stared at it, every muscle in my body tightening. He hadn't just complained about me. He'd forged official paperwork to make it look like I was breaking the law. "Is this even legal?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mrs. Elkins sighed. "No, ma'am. Only the property owner can request zoning modification, not the HOA, and certainly not an individual board member. HOAs can suggest changes, but they can't override county zoning laws." That line hit me like thunder. HOAs cannot override county zoning laws. Greg had built his entire campaign of harassment on a lie. One he'd written into the system himself. Mrs. Elkins photocopied the forged page and handed me a copy. "Keep that safe," she said. "If this goes to court, that document will matter." I walked out into the parking lot, the morning sun blinding my eyes, the copy trembling in my hands. Every humiliation, every threat, every police visit, all of it traced back to one fraudulent signature. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at Greg's name at the bottom of that page. The man who had smiled at my husband's funeral. The man who had once told me I was a credit to the neighborhood. Now he was the one breaking the law. That forged signature was my proof. And Greg's downfall. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my board?" Greg shouted, slamming his fist on the table. The room went silent, except for my heartbeat. It was the monthly HOA meeting. The one Greg had used for months to spread lies about me. But this time, I wasn't coming empty-handed. I walked into that stuffy clubhouse with a folder tucked under my arm, the same one Mrs. Elkins from the county had given me. My proof, my weapon. Dozens of neighbors filled the folding chairs, fanning themselves in the stale air. Greg sat at the head of the long table, his nameplate perfectly centered, his tie a little too tight. He glanced up when he saw me walk in and smirked. "Ah, Mrs. Mitchell," he said. "Here to discuss your ongoing violations?" "Actually," I said, my voice steady, "I'm here to discuss yours." The murmur that rippled through the room made him blink. I opened my folder and pulled out two documents, my original zoning certificate and the forged version with his signature. I laid them flat on the table for everyone to see. "This," I said, pointing to the forged page, "is what you sent to the county office under my name. This is your handwriting, your signature. You changed my zoning file to make it look like I was breaking the law." Greg let out a short, forced laugh. "That's ridiculous. Anyone could have typed that. You don't understand how administrative corrections work." "Administrative corrections?" I repeated. "The county clerk confirmed only the homeowner can request a zoning modification. Not the HOA, and certainly not the president acting alone." The room buzzed. I saw Mrs. Henson, the neighbor who'd avoided me for weeks, lean forward, squinting at the papers. Pete, my next-door neighbor, whispered to his wife. Greg's smirk wavered. "Folks," he said loudly, trying to regain control, "this is just another example of misinformation. The county's records are outdated. I was protecting our community. By forging my signature?" I shot back. My voice trembled, but it carried through the room. "You humiliated me in front of police. You vandalized my reputation. You used your position to manipulate law enforcement. And now the proof is right here." Greg's face turned red. His hands clenched. "You're out of line," he barked. "No, Greg," I said quietly. "You are." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner and the faint tapping of someone's nervous pen. Then, finally, a voice from the back. "Let her speak." That broke him. Greg stood up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. "This meeting is over," he snapped. He snatched up his clipboard, storming out of the clubhouse, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the glass. For the first time in months, I felt the room tilt in my favor. People were whispering. Not about me, but about him. I walked out into the warm night air, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. I'd exposed him, but men like Greg didn't lose quietly. The next morning, I found out just how far he was willing to go. Someone had spray-painted "illegal mechanic" across my garage door. The crack of metal woke me up. Then the sound of laughter fading into the dark. When I opened the door, my mailbox was in pieces. It was just after midnight, the kind of silence where you can hear every creak of the house. I'd been half asleep, trying to let go of the chaos from the HOA meeting, when the crash jolted me upright. At first, I thought it was a car accident, but as I stepped outside, the cool air hit me, and I saw the truth. The pole of my mailbox lay twisted in the grass, the box itself crushed flat like someone had stomped on it. A few envelopes were scattered down the street, one torn open, the rest soaked by the sprinklers. And in the middle of the road, I saw the faint glimmer of tire tracks, fresh, leading straight past my driveway. I stood there barefoot, heart pounding, staring into the dark street that had suddenly stopped feeling like home. Somewhere, an engine started and faded away. By morning, I'd already filed a report, but I knew how this would go. The police would mark it as vandalism, unknown suspect, and nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. This was a message. Sure enough, 2 days later, another HOA letter arrived. This one claimed I owed escalated fines for repeated violations, nearly $200. I read it twice, my hands trembling. None of the citations had proof. No dates, no signatures, just bold claims and Greg's initials at the bottom. It didn't stop there. By the end of the week, the HOA newsletter had a section titled "Community Concerns, Unsafe Activity." They didn't name me outright, but everyone knew who they were talking about. Phrases like residential disruption, questionable mechanical work, and neighborhood image were sprinkled throughout. That's when I realized Greg had turned this into a campaign, not just to silence me, but to publicly destroy me. So I decided to fight back. I went online and ordered 2 motion-activated cameras, the kind that send footage straight to your phone. I installed one under the eaves facing the driveway and another by the mailbox. If Greg wanted to stalk me, I'd make sure every move he made was recorded. The next night, my phone buzzed just after 11:01 p.m. Motion detected. I opened the app and froze. A familiar silver SUV rolled slowly past my house. Headlights dimmed. It paused at the curb, lingered for 10 long seconds, and then kept going. Greg Sanders. Even in the grainy footage, I recognized his vanity plate. The same one that sat in his HOA president's parking space every month. That was my breaking point, and my turning point. The next morning, I made another report, this time directly to the State Real Estate Division, the agency that oversees HOA misconduct. I'd read that harassment and targeted enforcement by HOA officials can be reported and investigated at the state level. So that's exactly what I did. I attached the footage, the fake fines, and the forged documents. Everything. For the first time in months, I felt like I was doing more than just surviving. I was fighting back. But Greg wasn't done trying to scare me. The very next morning, I opened my front door and saw a sheet of paper taped to it. Crisp white, bold black lettering at the top. Eviction notice, it read. My breath caught. My mortgage was paid. My name was on the deed. This couldn't be real, but it looked official enough to make my stomach drop. I peeled it off and looked closer. No court stamp, no signature, just Greg's handwriting in blue ink at the bottom. It wasn't real, but the fear it brought was. The next day, I found an eviction notice taped to my front door. Fake, but terrifyingly real. When I opened the door this time, it wasn't the police, it was a man with a county badge. Laura Mitchell? He asked. We need to talk about your HOA president. For a moment, I didn't breathe. His calm tone wasn't like the officers who'd come before. No hostility, no accusation. Just quiet authority. He introduced himself as Detective Alejandro Ramirez from the County Fraud and Records Division. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, shirt sleeves rolled up, the kind of man who'd seen enough lies to recognize them from a mile away. Mind if I come in? He asked. I led him to the kitchen table, still cluttered with coffee mugs, HOA letters, and the fake eviction notice I hadn't been able to throw away. He sat down, scanning everything with practiced precision. You filed a complaint through the real estate division last week, right? Yes, I said. I sent them everything. Videos, fines, the forged zoning file. He nodded slowly. We've seen this pattern before. Overstepping authority, falsified records, harassment tactics, but this one's sophisticated. I slid the photocopy of the forged zoning modification across the table. Greg Sanders' signature, I said quietly. He forged county paperwork to make my property look like it was illegal. Ramirez studied it, then took out a small magnifying glass from his jacket pocket. He compared the signature on the forged form with another I'd printed from a recent HOA newsletter. It's a match, he murmured. You've got him dead to rights on this. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. So, what happens now? He leaned back in his chair. I'll need to verify this through the county archives, and I'll start interviewing board members and neighbors. Don't contact him. Don't tip him off. Just go about your routine. It sounded simple, but my hands still trembled. Detective, he's not going to stop. He's been driving by my house at night. Ramirez looked up from his notes. We'll handle that, he said, his voice firm but calm. If he steps foot on your property again, call me directly. He handed me his card. A. Ramirez County Fraud Division. The next few days were strangely quiet. No letters, no vandalism, no Greg. It almost felt like he was hiding, but Detective Ramirez wasn't. I saw him twice that week, walking the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, asking quiet questions. Neighbors who'd once ignored me suddenly wanted to talk, as if the presence of a county investigator had given them permission to speak the truth. Mrs. Henson admitted Greg had pressured her into signing a petition about me. Pete said Greg threatened to fine him if he parked near my house. Even the HOA secretary, a nervous young man named Dylan, confessed that Greg had removed certain files from the association's records before the last meeting. When Ramirez came by again, his expression was darker. "Your HOA's missing pages from their official record book," he said. "Financial ledgers, complaint logs, gone. And all the missing pages are from the same months your violations were filed." I felt my stomach twist. "So he's covering his tracks." "Trying to," Ramirez said, standing. "But we've got enough to move forward." He tapped the folder under his arm. "You did the right thing documenting everything. This isn't just harassment anymore, Mrs. Mitchell. This is fraud." He left that evening, promising to update me soon. I locked the door behind him, exhaling for what felt like the first time in weeks. Hours later, just as I was about to turn in for the night, my phone rang. Unknown number again. "Mrs. Mitchell," Ramirez's voice said on the other end, low and certain. "Be home tomorrow morning. We're moving in." Ramirez called me that night. "Be home tomorrow morning. We're moving in." Sirens wailed, but this time, they were pointed at Greg's office. I watched from across the street as officers carried out boxes of files. The morning was calm, the sky painted in pale blue, and for the first time in months, I'd woken up without dread clawing at my chest. Ramirez's words still echoed in my head. "Be home tomorrow morning. We're moving in." I hadn't realized what he meant until I saw the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the fog, parked right outside the HOA management building. The place that had sent me dozens of violation notices now looked like the scene of a scandal. I parked across the street, hands gripping the steering wheel as I watched county investigators stream through the glass doors. They were calm, efficient, men and women in plain clothes carrying boxes, clipboards, evidence bags. And then I saw him, Greg Sanders, standing by the reception desk, his face pale, sweat beading along his hairline. He tried to talk, gesturing wildly as one of the investigators opened a filing cabinet. Papers flew everywhere. Within minutes, the team uncovered stacks of altered documents, copies of zoning maps with my address highlighted, police complaint forms with forged signatures, and HOA meeting minutes full of missing pages. It didn't take long for Greg to realize the game was over. He reached for a stack of papers, hands trembling, trying to feed them into a small shredder on the corner desk. But the officer next to him was faster. Ramirez stepped forward, his voice steady and low. "Don't," he said, pulling the plug. "Those are county records. You're done, Mr. Sanders." Greg looked up at him, defiant but shaking. "You don't understand," he hissed. "I was protecting the community. She was following the law." Ramirez interrupted, holding up one of the forged documents. "You weren't." Neighbors began gathering outside, murmuring, whispering. The same people who had once crossed the street to avoid me now stared through the glass, watching their self-proclaimed protector unravel. From my car, I could see everything: Greg's desperate face, the flashing lights bouncing off the glass, the slow procession of truth catching up to arrogance. Ramirez walked out first, talking to a deputy and handing over evidence bags. Then a few minutes later, Greg followed, his wrists cuffed, his shoulders stiff. Cameras clicked from reporters who'd already caught wind of the raid. A chill ran through me as he stepped into view. Even with the cuffs on, he searched the crowd until his eyes found mine. For a second, everything went quiet. The sirens, the murmurs, the chaos. All of it faded as he locked eyes with me, his face twisting into a bitter smile. "This isn't over," he said, voice low but clear enough for me to hear through the car window. I didn't look away. I just gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the weight of justice settling in. Greg Sanders, the man who'd weaponized power and paper, was finally caught in his own web. As Greg was led away in cuffs, he looked right at me and said, "This isn't over." For 2 weeks, it was silent. Then a white envelope slid under my door. Greg's attorney demanding I retract my story. It was the kind of silence that almost felt suspicious. After the raid, the neighborhood that once treated me like a criminal suddenly shifted. The same people who used to glare at me from behind half-closed blinds now waved when I passed. Mrs. Henson brought over a casserole. Pete offered to help repaint my garage door. Even the mailman smiled again. For the first time in months, I felt like I belonged here. The news had done its part. Local outlets ran the story under bold headlines. HOA president arrested in forgery and fraud investigation. They mentioned my name too. Homeowner Laura Mitchell's complaint led to the discovery of falsified zoning documents and misuse of HOA authority. I wasn't sure if I liked the attention, but deep down, it felt good to finally have the truth out there. I thought it was over. Then the letter arrived. It was late afternoon. I was in the garage, tightening a belt on an old Chevy engine, the radio humming quietly in the background, when I heard the soft scrape at the front door. No knock, just that faint slide of paper against the floor. When I picked it up, my hands went cold. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, embossed with gold lettering. Sanders and Price, attorneys at law. I tore it open before I could talk myself out of it. Inside was a 2-page letter, full of legal jargon and venom disguised as professionalism. It claimed I'd defamed Greg Sanders by knowingly spreading false statements and public accusations. It demanded a written retraction within 10 days, or they'd pursue damages for character assassination and emotional distress. I laughed at first, a bitter, shaky laugh that barely sounded human. He's sitting in a cell, and he still thinks he can threaten me. But then the fear crept in. What if he had resources? What if he used loopholes, connections, anything to drag me back into his mess? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow on the wall looked like another letter, another attack. I'd fought so hard to prove my innocence. But this was different. Courtrooms, lawyers, fees. It was overwhelming. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the letter, the words blurring through tears I didn't even realize were there. Ryan walked in, bleary-eyed, holding his cereal bowl. "Mom, you okay?" I forced a smile. "Just paperwork, honey. Don't worry." But I was worried, more than I wanted to admit. By noon, there was a knock at my door. This time, I almost didn't answer. But when I did, I saw Pete and 3 other neighbors standing there, holding paint buckets. "We figured it's time we fix what he ruined," Pete said simply. Behind him, a small group of neighbors, people who once whispered about me, were smiling. Someone had brought rollers, another a tray of white primer. I didn't have words. I just nodded and led them to the garage. For the rest of the afternoon, the sound of paint rollers filled the air. Slow, steady, rhythmic. Each stroke covered the hateful red spray paint Greg's people had left behind. It felt symbolic, like we were painting over everything he'd tried to take from me. My dignity, my peace, my home. Neighbors laughed, kids helped. Someone brought lemonade. For a brief, beautiful moment, the street felt like a community again. Later that evening, when the last roller was cleaned and everyone had gone home, I stood back and looked at the garage door. Fresh white paint gleamed under the porch light, smooth and clean, as if the word illegal had never been there. I took a deep breath, and something shifted inside me. The fear that had haunted me for months turned into something sharper, stronger. Resolve. Greg could send all the lawyers he wanted. He could throw every threat, every trick, every paper he could afford. But I wasn't backing down. I had evidence, I had witnesses, and now I had a community that finally saw the truth. If he wanted a courtroom fight, he was going to get one. And this time, I wouldn't be the one on defense. If he wanted a courtroom fight, he was about to get one. For 2 weeks, it was silent. Then a white envelope slid under my door. Greg's attorney demanding I retract my story. It was the kind of silence that almost felt suspicious. After the raid, the neighborhood that once treated me like a criminal suddenly shifted. The same people who used to glare at me from behind half-closed blinds now waved when I passed. Mrs. Henson brought over a casserole. Pete offered to help repaint my garage door. Even the mailman smiled again. For the first time in months, I felt like I belonged here. The news had done its part. Local outlets ran the story under bold headlines. HOA president arrested in forgery and fraud investigation. They mentioned my name too. Homeowner Laura Mitchell's complaint led to the discovery of falsified zoning documents and misuse of HOA authority. I wasn't sure if I liked the attention, but deep down, it felt good to finally have the truth out there. I thought it was over. Then the letter arrived. It was late afternoon. I was in the garage, tightening a belt on an old Chevy engine, the radio humming quietly in the background, when I heard the soft scrape at the front door. No knock. Just that faint slide of paper against the floor. When I picked it up, my hands went cold. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, embossed with gold lettering. Sanders and Price, attorneys at law. I tore it open before I could talk myself out of it. Inside was a 2-page letter, full of legal jargon and venom disguised as professionalism. It claimed I'd defamed Greg Sanders by knowingly spreading false statements and public accusations. It demanded a written retraction within 10 days, or they'd pursue damages for character, assassination, and emotional distress. I laughed at first, a bitter, shaky laugh that barely sounded human. He's sitting in a cell, and he still thinks he can threaten me. But then the fear crept in. What if he had resources? What if he used loopholes, connections, anything to drag me back into his mess? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow on the wall looked like another letter, another attack. I'd fought so hard to prove my innocence, but this was different. Courtrooms, lawyers, fees, it was overwhelming. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the letter, the words blurring through tears I didn't even realize were there. Ryan walked in, bleary-eyed, holding his cereal bowl. "Mom, you okay?" I forced a smile. "Just paperwork, honey. Don't worry." But I was worried, more than I wanted to admit. By noon, there was a knock at my door. This time, I almost didn't answer. But when I did, I saw Pete and 3 other neighbors standing there, holding paint buckets. "We figured it's time we fix what he ruined," Pete said simply. Behind him, a small group of neighbors, people who once whispered about me, were smiling. Someone had brought rollers, another a tray of white primer. I didn't have words. I just nodded and led them to the garage. For the rest of the afternoon, the sound of paint rollers filled the air, slow, steady, rhythmic. Each stroke covered the hateful red spray paint Greg's people had left behind. It felt symbolic, like we were painting over everything he'd tried to take from me. My dignity, my peace, my home. Neighbors laughed. Kids helped. Someone brought lemonade. For a brief, beautiful moment, the street felt like a community again. Later that evening, when the last roller was cleaned and everyone had gone home, I stood back and looked at the garage door. Fresh white paint gleamed under the porch light, smooth and clean, as if the word illegal had never been there. I took a deep breath, and something shifted inside me. The fear that had haunted me for months turned into something sharper, stronger, resolve. Greg could send all the lawyers he wanted. He could throw every threat, every trick, every paper he could afford. But I wasn't backing down. I had evidence, I had witnesses, and now I had a community that finally saw the truth. If he wanted a courtroom fight, he was going to get one. And this time, I wouldn't be the one on defense. If he wanted a courtroom fight, he was about to get one. The folder was thick. Photos, names, addresses. Greg hadn't just targeted me. He'd been running the same scam for years. For a moment, I just stood there on the courthouse steps, the world buzzing around me. Greg's wife pressed the manila folder into my hands, her eyes red but steady. "You should have this," she said quietly. He kept everything. Every victim. I wanted to ask her why. Why now? Why me? But before I could, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of reporters and flashing cameras. The weight of the folder felt heavier than anything I'd carried in my life. Not just paper, but truth. That night, after Ryan was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were at least 20 files, all neatly labeled. HOA names, addresses, complaints. Every one of them stamped with Greg's initials. Some had newspaper clippings, Others had photos of homeowners standing in front of their properties, arms crossed in defiance or despair. One name jumped out at me: Margaret Jensen, Willow Creek Estates. I recognized it immediately. It was the same neighborhood Greg had lived in before moving to ours. According to the letter attached, Margaret had faced nearly identical harassment, violations, fines, and eventually a forced foreclosure when she couldn't pay the bogus penalties. I read until sunrise. Each story felt like reading another version of my own life. People accused of false violations, public shaming, even forged documents. Greg had made a business out of bullying homeowners. He'd inflate fines, create fake bylaws, and when people couldn't pay, he'd force property liens and sell the homes below market value to friends and shell companies tied back to him. He wasn't just a petty tyrant. He was a criminal mastermind hiding behind HOA paperwork. By morning, I called Detective Ramirez. My voice was shaking, but not from fear, from fury. "Detective," I said, "you need to see this." 2 hours later, Ramirez sat in my living room, that same calm focus in his eyes. He flipped through the folder page by page, his jaw tightening with every new document. "This is bigger than we thought," he said finally. "Much bigger." He closed the folder and stood. "We're reopening his old cases. Every one of these victims deserves what you got: justice." A week later, it was official. The county announced a multi-neighborhood investigation into fraudulent HOA activity linked to Greg Sanders. Local news stations ran follow-up stories showing homeowners from different parts of the state stepping forward, holding their own letters and photos. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. Greg's scheme was being dismantled, one forged form at a time. And even though he was already facing jail time, new charges were stacking faster than his lawyers could file appeals. He'd built an empire out of manipulation, and now it was collapsing under its own lies. Meanwhile, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. My garage, my sanctuary, came back to life. The walls were freshly painted white, the floor sealed, tools neatly lined up just like Tom had kept them. The smell of grease and steel filled the air again, that familiar symphony of work and peace. I reopened my small garage service, legally this time, with my mixed-use permit proudly displayed by the door. And when my first customer walked in, a nervous young mom with a dented minivan, I smiled and said, "Don't worry, I know what it's like to need a fresh start." Word spread quickly. Within a month, I had steady work, neighbors stopping by not to complain, but to thank me. Ryan even helped after school, wiping tools and learning the basics of his dad's trade. One afternoon, Detective Ramirez stopped by. He looked around the garage, hands in his pockets. "Looks like you've rebuilt more than just a workspace," he said. I nodded. "Yeah, I rebuilt my life." He smiled faintly. "You did more than that. You changed the system." After he left, I stood in the open doorway of the garage, the evening sunlight stretching long across the driveway. The quiet no longer scared me. It felt earned. Greg Sanders had tried to take my peace, my reputation, my home, but in doing so, he'd exposed something rotten that went far beyond my street. And now others were fighting back too. I thought of Tom then, and how proud he'd be. The garage he dreamed of had become the place that gave me, and now others, their voices back. As I turned off the lights and locked up for the night, I taped one last message inside my toolbox. A reminder to myself and anyone who'd ever feel powerless against corruption. Truth leaves a paper trail. Always follow it. This isn't just my victory. It's a warning. To every HOA bully, every board member drunk on control. You can write lies on paper, but you can't erase the truth forever. What would you do if your HOA tried to ruin your life? Tell your story in the comments, because maybe, just maybe, the next file that brings justice could be yours. I thought it was all over. I thought peace had finally returned. But 2 weeks later, a new notice appeared in my mailbox from the new HOA president. And this one had Greg's old signature stamped right at the bottom. But I never expected what the next HOA president would do with Greg's old files.